Okay, so let's take a closer look at what we mean by a three-layer design in our application, or three-layer architecture. Basically, we have the database, which is in the debug folder. It has our table with data in it. And in this case, it's just a very simple application with a table with student names and for a student roster. And we have what is called a data layer class. This is just a class like any other class, but it has a very special job to do. And this class is going to have all the code that handles all of the database interactions, reading data from the database, inserting new records into the database, updating existing records, deleting existing records, and so on. So any of the interactions with the database are handled by the data layer class. Okay, and we'll take a look at that. And then we have the middle layer here, or the middle tier, which is the business layer. And that contains any classes that represent your quote-unquote business objects. In this case, it's the student, because this is like a academic or student application. But if we were writing an application for a business with products, then we would maybe have a product class or an item class, an employee class, whatever. So that's the business layer with the types of classes that you're well familiar with at this point. And then finally, the third layer, or the top layer, so to speak, is the user interface layer, and this is where your form class is. So the point of the three-layer architecture is to get a lot of these database functions, or a lot of that code from the database interactions out of the form class, and to better organize and compartmentalize. That's just the better way to design an application. Okay, so we'll take a quick overall look at our application here. This is an application that will read student records from a database and allow the user to edit, update, delete, and so on. So we've got about 10 students in a table. The table is called MIS 254 in the database, and we'll look at the various functions. I'm not going to talk about them all in this video, but in the next videos after this, I'll address each of these functions. Okay, so let's just take a quick look here. I've got everything set up. If you look at the data sources, I did do an empty data set so that I have that new copy functionality. After every time I build the program, I get that new copy copied into the debug folder, that pristine copy. So that's just an empty data set. And then here is our object-bound data source, which I discussed in the previous video. That's how you're going to start, by coding your business layer class, in this case student, and then doing the bound controls based on that object. Okay. So then, moving further, we have not talked about this. I've added a data layer class. And you do that just the way you would add any other class, by right-clicking the project name, adding the class. I called mine data layer. You can call it whatever you want, but something explicit like data layer, or something, a student data layer, something like that, is a good idea. And then just a very brief overview. In my data layer class, I make sure I'm using an access database, so you need the system.data OLEDB at the top, and this one as well. So make sure you include those using statements up at the top. And then I'm not going to, there's a lot of code here, and I'll talk about this in later videos, but basically at the top here, right inside the class, we have our connection object, our command object, which is like a vehicle for our SQL commands, and the data reader. And I said this, we talked about this object before, the data reader. His job is exactly as the name implies, is to read data out of the database. Okay, and the connection object is, of course, just plugging into a database and establishing that connection to the database. So those three ADO.NET objects, or OLEDB objects, we can say, because it's an access specific. And then in the constructor of my data layer, I am going to establish the connection, typing the connection string very carefully, and then opening up that connection. Okay, and then I'll just talk about this method here. This is the method that will initially pull all of the students out of the database, out of the table, the MIS 254 table in the database. And basically, what we've done is we've created a list the good old list that we've been using pretty much all semester, created a list of type student, and then I'm going to set up a simple SQL statement, a select statement to get all of the records, all of the data out of the MIS 254 table in the database. And then I'm going to set up a command object to carry that SQL statement to the database, and I'm going to execute it, and I'm going to use my student reader to read the data elements in one at a time, first the ID, then the first name, then the last name. Very importantly, these items, these names that you put in quotes in this part have got to match the database columns perfectly, okay? Just to prove a point here, let me open up this database if I can through the Solution Explorer. Oh, okay, yeah, oh, that's nice. I didn't realize you could do that. I double-click the database object here, and if you drill down into the tables, this will give you a look at the database. And see, these are the names of the columns in the MIS 254 table. So that's a nice functionality there. Oh, it opened in the Server Explorer, which is interesting. Okay, so try that out when you're working with your final project. Okay, so basically I've read the elements in one at a time. I create a brand new student object, and then I add that, which is populated with the data items that we just read in, and then I throw that into the list of type student, which we've called all students here. Okay, that was our list of type student. All right, and then finally, when all said and done, I'm going to close up that command object, which will also close up the database connection because we did this. Okay, that'll close the con object as well. Don't leave those connections hanging open. When you're done, you're done. Close it all up. And then finally, we're returning that list, that fully populated list of students. Now, returning it where? Let me go over to the form here. I'm going to double click, and interestingly, okay, we have a list of type student, which I'm calling roster. Okay, let me back up here. We have the a data layer object, which I'm going to call data handler. And notice we have the keyword new, which means we're actually creating an object here. And that constructor that we looked at, which had the connection string and the establishing the connection, opening the connection to the database, will execute when that object is created. So now the connection is open, and we have this list of type student, which we're calling roster. And what we'll do is in the form load, as soon as the application begins, we're saying roster equals data handler get students from database, and that's the method that we just talked about over in the data layer, which reaches into the database, gets all those students, and then returns the populated list. And this is where the populated list is landing, so to speak, in this roster variable. Okay, and then interestingly, we have, when you set up your object-bound data source, you don't get a whole lot of items in the component tray. You do get a binding source, and that's it. Okay, binding source related to these bound controls here, and these controls are bound to the fields or the properties in your student object. But anyway, basically, what you have to do is set the binding source's data source property to that roster, that list that you just got the data into. And that basically takes care of it. And maybe like before you test, you can code these really quickly. Everything, it's the same as what you've been doing in previous assignments. The binding source has some really useful methods for just moving back and forth through the data, move first, move next, and whatnot. And that'll be enough to get you started and have you seeing data and being able to move through the data. So maybe in the next example or the next video, we'll talk about one of the other operations in the data layer.